Blood for the gods. Understanding Aztec sacrifice, the sacred debt. In the pre-dawn darkness of Tenochtitlan, while the city still slumbered beneath the protective embrace of night, the priests of Huitzilopochtli began their sacred preparations. The air hung thick with copal incense, and the distant sound of conch shells calling the faithful to witness. For this was the day when the cosmic debt would be repaid, when human hearts would feed the hungry sun and ensure its continued journey across the heavens. High atop the Templo Maya, as the first pale fingers of dawn reached across Lake Texcoco, Tlacaelel, the high priest, raised his obsidian blade toward the eastern horizon. This was no mere knife, but a fragment of volcanic glass, so sharp it could split a hair, so sacred it had been blessed by every high priest since the founding of the city. In his weathered hands, this humble tool became the instrument of cosmic necessity, the means by which mortals fulfilled their obligations to the gods who had sacrificed everything to create the world. The young warrior who lay upon the stone of sacrifice was no victim, but a volunteer, an eagle knight who had requested this honor after being wounded in battle against the Tlaxcalans. His name was Itzel, meaning star, and he had trained for this moment since childhood, understanding that true nobility lay not in accumulating wealth or titles, but in offering one's most precious possession, life itself, to sustain the universe. To Spanish conquistadors and modern observers, the scene that was about to unfold would appear as barbaric savagery, evidence of a civilization lost in demonic darkness. Yet to the Aztecs, gathered in the plaza below, this was the most sacred act conceivable, the willing reciprocation of divine sacrifice, the payment of humanity's eternal debt to gods who had died so mortals might live. The theological foundation of Aztec sacrifice rested upon a simple yet profound principle: reciprocity. Just as Nanahuatzin had thrown himself into the cosmic fire to become the sun, just as Quetzalcoatl had bled himself to create humanity from ancient bones, so too must humans offer their life essence to maintain the delicate balance that kept the universe functioning. Without this constant nourishment, the sun would halt in its course, rains would cease to fall, and the fifth sun would collapse into the same darkness that had claimed the four worlds that came before. As the sun's disk broke the horizon, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the colors of blood and flame, Tlacaelel spoke the ancient words that transformed human death into cosmic renewal. Receive this offering, O Huitzilopochtli, giver of life, sustainer of the sun. Accept this precious water, this flowering of the heart, that your light might continue to warm the world and drive away the demons of darkness. The obsidian blade descended with ritual precision, guided by centuries of tradition and theological necessity. In that moment when heart parted from body, when life force flowed forth in crimson streams, the Aztecs did not see murder, but metamorphosis, the transformation of mortal flesh into divine sustenance, the alchemy by which human sacrifice became cosmic salvation. The theology of transformation. To understand Aztec sacrifice, one must first comprehend their vision of reality as a vast web of obligations and exchanges that connected every level of existence, from the humblest maize plant to the greatest cosmic force. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything was bound together by relationships of reciprocal giving that maintained universal harmony. Humans owed their existence to divine sacrifice. Plants owed their growth to human care and ritual attention, while animals owed their lives to the nourishment they provided other creatures. This worldview rejected the notion of free gifts or unearned benefit. The gods had not created humanity out of benevolent generosity, but through agonizing self-sacrifice that demanded reciprocation. When Quetzalcoatl lied his penis to mix divine blood with the bones of previous creation, when Nunahuatzin threw himself into the cosmic fire, when all the gods gave their lives to set the sun and moon in motion, they established a pattern of sacrifice that mortals were obligated to continue. The daily ritual of bloodletting that accompanied sunrise prayers reflected this theological understanding. Priests throughout the empire would pierce their earlobes with maguey thorns, allowing drops of blood to fall upon sacred papers that were then burned as offering. This was not penance for sin but payment on an eternal debt, acknowledgement that life required life to sustain itself, that consciousness itself carried the obligation to nourish the forces that made consciousness possible. The calendar that governed Aztec religious observances reflected this cosmic debt through its intricate scheduling of offerings, ceremonies, and festivals. Each day carried its own divine influences and obligations, while the interlocking wheels of the 260-day tonal Pohoali and 365-day Upohoali created temporal patterns that determined when specific gods required particular forms of nourishment. During the month of Atkawalo, dedicated to Tlaloc and the rain spirits, children were sacrificed at mountain shrines where their tears were understood to particularly please the water deity. These ceremonies occurred during the dry season when drought threatened agricultural survival, making divine intervention a matter of life or death for entire community. The choice of children as victims reflected not cruelty but theological logic. Their innocence made them pure offerings, while their tears demonstrated the community's desperate need for divine mercy. The festival of Huapopule, the new fire ceremony that occurred every 52 years, required the most elaborate sacrificial offerings, because it marked the moment when the cosmic cycle renewed itself. On this night, all fires throughout the empire were extinguished, while priests climbed the Hill of Stars to determine whether the gods would permit another cycle of creation. If the Pleiades crossed the meridian at midnight, it signaled divine approval for continued existence, and a new fire was kindled in the chest cavity of a high-ranking prisoner, whose heart had just been removed. This fire was then carried to temples throughout the empire, rekindling the sacred flames that burned continuously in honor of various deities. The theological sophistication of these rituals extended to their symbolic meanings and cosmic connection. Heart sacrifice represented the offering of Tonali, the life force that resided in blood and sustained consciousness. By extracting hearts while they still beat, priests ensured that this vital essence remained potent enough to nourish the gods effectively. The direction of blood flow, the positioning of bodies, and the timing of rituals all carried specific meanings that connected earthly actions to celestial movements. Drowning sacrifices performed for Tlaloc occurred at sacred springs and cenotes that served as gateways to the underworld where the rain god dwelled. Victims dressed as Tlaloc's servants were thrown into these waters with offerings of jade, gold, and precious feathers, their deaths serving to carry human prayers directly to the divine realm. The bubbles that rose from drowning bodies were interpreted as messages from Tlaloc, indicating his acceptance of the offerings and his willingness to provide rain in return. The flaying rituals associated with Xipe Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, represented the agricultural cycle of death and renewal that governed maize cultivation. Priests who wore the skins of sacrificed victims embodied the god's power to shed old forms and emerge in new vitality, while the gradual decay of these human hides symbolized the natural process by which seeds buried in earth emerged as growing plants. These ceremonies were not random acts of violence but carefully orchestrated communications with divine forces, each element chosen for its theological significance and cosmic effectiveness. The instruments used in sacrifice, obsidian knives, jade receptacles, feathered costumes, were themselves sacred objects that had been blessed through elaborate rituals and charged with supernatural power. The sacred architecture of death, the Templo Maya, stood at the heart of Tenochtitlan like a cosmic mountain connecting earth to heaven, its twin pyramids dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc rising 200 feet above the lake surface. Every stone of this massive structure carried religious significance, while every architectural detail reflected theological principles that governed Aztec understanding of divine human relationships. The temple's orientation aligned with astronomical phenomena that determined sacrificial timing. The eastern face caught the first rays of dawn, symbolically connecting solar worship with the blood offerings that fed the sun each morning. The steep staircases that climbed toward the shrine at the summit replicated the difficult ascent that souls made toward divine realms, while the platforms at various levels provided stages for different types of ceremonial activity. At the temple's apex stood two shrines, each containing sacred images and ritual implements appropriate to the deities honored there. Huitzilopochtli's shrine blazed with gold and precious feathers that reflected sunlight like crystallized flame, while Tlaloc's sanctuary displayed blue and green stones that evoked the colors of sky and water. The contrast between these divine domains emphasized the complementary relationship between war and rain, sun and water, the forces that governed human survival in the high valleys of central Mexico. The sacrificial stone that dominated Huitzilopochtli's platform was carved from basalt and shaped with mathematical precision to facilitate heart extraction. Its curved surface thrust victims' chests upward while providing stable support for the priests who performed the crucial ritual. Channels carved into the stone's surface guided blood flow toward collection vessels, ensuring that none of the precious life force was wasted or allowed to pollute sacred space inappropriately. The skull rack, or tsompantli, that stood adjacent to the temple displayed the heads of sacrificial victims in carefully ordered rows that demonstrated both the volume of offerings made to the gods and the imperial power capable of commanding such resources. Spanish conquistadors who saw these structures estimated they contained over 100,000 human skulls, though archaeological evidence suggests the actual numbers were somewhat smaller. Regardless of precise quantities, these displays served multiple functions: religious, political, and psychological, that reinforced Aztec authority while honoring divine requirement. The Karmakek, the priestly school attached to the temple complex, trained young nobles in the theological knowledge and ritual techniques required for sacrificial ceremony. Students spent years learning the precise movements, incantations, and astronomical calculations that governed various forms of offering. They practiced on animal hearts before being permitted to participate in human sacrifices, gradually developing the physical skills and spiritual understanding necessary for these demanding ceremonies. The architectural complexity of the temple precinct reflected the sophisticated organization required for major sacrificial events. Storage chambers held the elaborate costumes, masks, and implements used in different rituals, while residential quarters housed the hundreds of priests, students, and temple servants who maintained daily religious observance. Workshops produced the paper, copal, and other materials consumed in vast quantities during festival periods. The acoustic properties of the temple courtyards amplified ceremonial sounds, chanting, music, and the cries of victims, ensuring they could be heard throughout the capital. This auditory dimension of sacrifice reinforced its public nature while creating psychological effects that deepened emotional participation among witnesses. The visual drama of blood flowing down white limestone steps created equally powerful imagery that connected earthly offerings with cosmic necessities. Sacred pools within the temple complex allowed priests to purify themselves before and after sacrificial duties, while also providing water for washing ritual implements and preparing offerings. The theological significance of this cleansing extended beyond mere hygiene to encompass spiritual purification that enabled proper communication with divine forces. The temple's multiple levels accommodated different types of sacrificial activities appropriate to various deities and ceremonial contexts. The highest platforms served for offerings to solar and sky gods, while lower levels were used for earth and water deities. This vertical organization reflected Aztec cosmology's layered structure, with different divine realms occupying distinct positions in the universal hierarchy. The seasonal modifications made to temple decorations acknowledged the changing religious emphases throughout the agricultural year. During rainy season festivals, blue and green banners honored water deities, while dry season ceremonies featured red and gold decorations appropriate to solar worship. These visual transformations helped maintain community awareness of shifting divine priorities and seasonal obligations. Vessels of divine will. The individuals chosen for sacrifice were not random victims but carefully selected vessels,
deemed worthy to carry human prayers and offerings to the divine realm. The process of selection involved multiple criteria: physical perfection, spiritual preparation, and often personal consent, that elevated sacrifice from mere execution to willing participation in cosmic necessity. Prisoners of war represented the most common source of sacrificial victims, but their capture and preparation involved elaborate protocols that transformed enemies into sacred offerings. The Flower Wars, or Reciprocity, fought specifically to obtain prisoners rather than territory or tribute, elevated military conflicts into religious quests that served both political and theological purpose. Warriors competed for the honor of capturing prestigious enemies, with successful captors receiving social advancement and material rewards that encouraged continued military service. The year-long preparation required for certain types of sacrifice demonstrated the profound spiritual investment involved in these ceremonies. Young men chosen to represent gods like Tezcatlipoca lived in luxury and were treated as living deities before their eventual sacrifice. They received the finest clothes, the choicest foods, and the most beautiful consorts, while learning the songs, dances, and behaviors appropriate to their divine roles. These god impersonators, known as Axaptila, were not merely symbols but were understood to become actual manifestations of divine presence. Their every action carried religious significance, while their eventual death served to renew the god's presence among the people. The theological complexity of this relationship challenged simple distinctions between representation and reality, suggesting that spiritual transformation could occur through appropriate ritual preparation. Women chosen for sacrifice to fertility deities underwent similar processes of elevation and preparation that acknowledged their crucial role in cosmic renewal. These ceremonies often coincided with agricultural festivals that celebrated feminine creative power, with victims dressed as goddesses and honored as manifestations of divine fertility before their deaths, served to ensure continued crop production. Children sacrificed to Tlaloc were typically purchased from poor families or captured in warfare, but their preparation involved elaborate rituals that transformed them into willing participants in divine communication. Dressed in blue and decorated with precious feathers and jewels, they were carried to mountain shrines where their tears were encouraged through various means, not out of cruelty but because Rain God particularly valued this form of offering. The psychological preparation of sacrificial victims involved intensive religious education that helped them understand their crucial role in maintaining cosmic balance. Priests explained how their deaths would nourish the gods and ensure continued divine protection for their communities, while ritual practices helped them achieve the spiritual state necessary for effective sacrifice.
The consent required from certain categories of victims reflected Aztec understanding that forced offerings were less valuable than willing gifts. Warriors who volunteered for sacrifice after battlefield injuries demonstrated the highest form of devotion, while their conscious choice to die for divine purposes enhanced the offering's spiritual potency. The physical perfection demanded of sacrificial victims reflected theological principles about appropriate gifts for divine consumption. Blemished or diseased individuals were considered unsuitable offerings, not from aesthetic prejudice, but from religious conviction that gods deserved only the finest human gifts. This standard applied equally to clothing, jewelry, and other materials used in sacrificial ceremonies. The social status of victims varied according to the specific deity being honored and the ceremony's importance. Major festivals required high-ranking prisoners whose deaths would demonstrate both imperial power and divine favor, while daily offerings could utilize lesser captives or volunteers from lower social ranks. This hierarchy of sacrifice reflected broader patterns of social organization, while ensuring that divine requirements received appropriate attention. The final hours before sacrifice involved purification rituals, confession of sins, and spiritual preparation that helped victims achieve the proper mental state for their transformation. These practices served both psychological and theological purposes, easing victims' fears while ensuring their deaths occurred in conditions that maximized spiritual effectiveness. The crimson currency, blood in Aztec theology, was far more than a bodily fluid. It was the fundamental currency of existence, the precious water that carried life force between gods and mortals, the liquid essence that fueled the cosmic machinery. Understanding sacrifice requires recognizing blood's sacred nature and the complex spiritual economics that governed its circulation throughout the universe. The Nahuatl word for blood, esteli, carried connotations of preciousness that connected it to jade, gold, and other treasures valued by Aztec society. But while material wealth could be accumulated and hoarded, blood's spiritual value lay precisely in its circulation, its movement from human hearts to divine sustenance, and back again through rain, fertility, and continued life. The daily bloodletting practiced by priests throughout the empire represented a form of spiritual taxation that acknowledged humanity's ongoing debt to divine forces. Using maguey thorns, obsidian blades, or stingray spines, religious officials would pierce their earlobes, tongues, or genitals, allowing drops of blood to fall upon bark paper that was then burned as incense. The smoke that rose from these offerings carried human life force directly to the gods, ensuring continuous divine nourishment that maintained cosmic stability. The graduated scale of blood offerings reflected different spiritual values and ceremonial requirements. Auto-sacrifice, performed by individuals, served personal religious obligations while demonstrating piety and devotion. Priestly bloodletting maintained the daily operations of temples and ensured continuous divine attention to community needs. Mass ceremonies during major festivals provided the concentrated spiritual nourishment necessary for cosmic renewal and seasonal transitions. The timing of blood offerings correlated with astronomical phenomena that determined divine accessibility and effectiveness. Dawn sacrifices fed the sun as it began its daily journey across the sky, while midnight offerings honored lunar and stellar deities who governed nighttime activities. Eclipse ceremonies required emergency sacrifices to restore cosmic balance when celestial mechanics went awry, threatening universal stability. The quality of blood offered carried theological significance that influenced ceremonial practices and victim selection. Young, healthy individuals produced blood deemed most potent for divine consumption, while the blood of warriors carried additional spiritual value derived from their courage and martial virtue. Women's menstrual blood was considered particularly powerful for fertility rituals, connecting feminine reproductive cycles to agricultural productivity. The ritual collection and distribution of sacrificial blood followed elaborate protocols that ensured its proper handling and maximum spiritual effectiveness. Sacred vessels made from jade, obsidian, and other precious materials served to contain this holy substance, while specific incantations and gestures governed its presentation to different deity. The theological distinction between willing and unwilling sacrifice affected blood's spiritual value, with voluntary offerings considered more potent than forced extraction. This principle encouraged the development of religious traditions that emphasized personal devotion and conscious participation in cosmic maintenance, rather than mere ritual observance. The geographic distribution of blood offerings reflected Aztec understanding of territorial spirituality and divine jurisdiction. Mountain shrines received sacrifices for sky gods, while underground caves served for earth deities and cenotes for water spirits. This spatial organization of ritual activities created a sacred landscape where blood offerings maintained proper relationships between human communities and their divine protectors. The seasonal variation in blood requirements acknowledged changing divine needs throughout the agricultural year. Dry season ceremonies emphasized solar worship and required offerings that would encourage continued sunshine and warmth, while rainy season rituals focused on water deities who demanded different types of spiritual nourishment. The social implications of blood sacrifice extended beyond religious observance to encompass political authority and imperial legitimacy. Rulers who personally participated in auto-sacrifice demonstrated their devotion to divine will, while their ability to command human sacrifices displayed the power and resources necessary for effective governance. The psychological impact of blood rituals on participants and observers created profound emotional experiences that reinforced religious conviction and social cohesion. The sight, smell, and sound of sacrificial ceremonies produced visceral responses that bypassed rational analysis,
and created direct spiritual communion with divine forces. The Feast of Transformation, the consumption of sacrificial victims' flesh, was not cannibalism in the European sense, but a sacred communion that completed the cycle of transformation begun with heart extraction. Through ritual eating, participants incorporated divine essence that had been concentrated in properly prepared human flesh, achieving spiritual unity with cosmic forces that ordinary consumption could never provide. The elaborate protocols governing ritual consumption reflected theological principles about appropriate relationships between gods, humans, and sacred substances. Only specific portions of sacrificial victims could be eaten, and only by individuals who had undergone proper spiritual preparation. The heart belonged to the gods alone and was never consumed by mortals, while other organs carried different spiritual significance that determined their ritual use. The preparation of sacrificial flesh involved complex culinary and religious processes that transformed human meat into sacred. Victims' bodies were carefully dismembered according to anatomical and theological principles, with each portion receiving specific treatment appropriate to its spiritual significance. The flesh was typically stewed with maize and chili peppers, creating a dish called tecatlioli that combined human protein with the sacred grains that sustained Mesoamerican civilization. The social distribution of sacrificial meat reflected hierarchical principles that governed Aztec society more broadly. The captor of a sacrificed prisoner received the choice portions, while relatives and allies shared smaller amounts that acknowledged their participation in the spiritual achievement. This distribution system created social bonds based on shared participation in divine communion, while reinforcing status distinctions through differential access to sacred substance. The psychological transformation experienced by consumers of sacrificial flesh represented one of Aztec religion's most profound spiritual technology. Participants reported sensations of enhanced spiritual awareness, direct communication with divine forces, and temporary transcendence of normal human limitation. These effects were understood not as psychological artifacts, but as genuine supernatural transformations that demonstrated the ritual's effectiveness. The timing of consumption ceremonies coordinated with astronomical events that maximized spiritual effectiveness, while ensuring proper divine attention. Full moon feasts honored lunar deities who governed fertility and transformation, while solar eclipse consumption served to restore cosmic balance during celestial emergencies. The taboos surrounding sacrificial consumption protected both participants and spiritual integrity of the ritual process. Pregnant women, menstruating females, and spiritually impure individuals were prohibited from consuming sacred flesh, not from prudish sensibilities, but from theological conviction that improper consumption could disrupt cosmic harmony. The therapeutic applications of sacrificial flesh reflected Aztec understanding of its concentrated spiritual power and healing potential. Small portions were used to treat spiritual ailments, protect against supernatural enemies, and enhance personal spiritual development. This medicinal use of human flesh represented sophisticated spiritual pharmacology that integrated religious practice with healthcare. The economic implications of ritual consumption created complex systems of exchange and obligation that extended far beyond immediate religious observance. The right to consume sacrificial flesh could be traded, inherited, or awarded as political favors, creating networks of spiritual and social relationships that strengthened community cohesion. The educational function of consumption rituals transmitted cultural knowledge and religious understanding from older to younger generations. Children who participated in these ceremonies learned theological principles, social obligations, and cultural values through direct spiritual experience, rather than mere intellectual instruction. The artistic representations of ritual consumption in Aztec sculpture, painting, and literature revealed sophisticated understanding of spiritual transformation and divine communion. These artistic works served not as mere documentation, but as spiritual technologies that extended ritual effectiveness beyond immediate ceremonial. The cosmic balance, the systematic practice of human sacrifice throughout the Aztec Empire, created a spiritual economy that sustained not only religious observance, but the entire cosmic order. that made civilized life possible. This was not barbarism, but sophisticated theology translated into practical action. A religious technology as complex and effective as any material achievement of Mesoamerican civilization. The astronomical precision required for proper sacrificial timing demonstrated the integration of scientific observation with religious practice that characterized Aztec intellectual achievement. Priest astronomers maintained detailed calendars that tracked celestial movements, predicted eclipses, and determined optimal moments for various types of offering. Their calculations required mathematical sophistication that rivaled contemporary European achievements while serving spiritual purposes that transcended mere intellectual curiosity. The political integration achieved through shared participation in sacrificial ceremonies created bonds of loyalty and identity that unified diverse populations under Aztec imperial authority. Communities that participated in major festivals developed emotional connections to the capital and its gods that made rebellion psychologically as well as practically difficult. The economic effects of sacrifice extended throughout imperial society, creating demand for luxury goods used in ceremonies, supporting specialist craftsmen who produced ritual implements, and generating trade networks that supplied exotic materials for major festivals. The feathers, jade, gold, and other precious substances consumed in sacrificial ceremonies represented significant economic resources whose circulation benefited merchants, artisans, and tributary communities. The environmental understanding embedded in sacrificial practices reflected sophisticated ecological knowledge that connected human spiritual obligations with natural cycles. Agricultural festivals acknowledged humanity's dependence on divine forces that controlled weather, fertility, and crop production, while seasonal ceremonies maintained proper relationships between human communities and their natural environment. The psychological benefits derived from sacrificial participation provided emotional satisfaction and spiritual meaning that enhanced quality of life for ordinary citizens. The knowledge that their community properly honored divine obligations created sense of security and cosmic purpose that made daily hardships more bearable while encouraging social cooperation and cultural cohesion. The educational transmission of sacrificial knowledge preserved complex theological, astronomical, and medical understanding that might otherwise have been lost. The lengthy training required for priests ensured continuity of specialized knowledge while creating intellectual traditions that advanced human understanding of natural and supernatural phenomena. The artistic achievement inspired by sacrificial themes produced some of Mesoamerica's greatest cultural treasures, including sculpture, architecture, and literature that communicated profound spiritual insights through aesthetic experience. These artistic works served religious functions while demonstrating human creative capacity stimulated by deep spiritual conviction. The moral framework created by sacrificial theology encouraged personal virtue and social responsibility by connecting individual behavior with cosmic consequence. The understanding that gods required proper offerings motivated ethical conduct and community service while discouraging selfish behavior that might offend divine sensibility. The Spanish conquest that ended systematic Aztec sacrifice was experienced by indigenous populations not as liberation, but as cosmic catastrophe, the disruption of spiritual relationships that had sustained the universe since creation. The collapse of sacrificial practices meant in Aztec understanding the abandonment of humanity's most fundamental obligations and the inevitable collapse of cosmic order. The persistence of sacrificial symbolism in contemporary Mexican culture demonstrates the enduring power of theological ideas that connected human action with cosmic necessity. Modern Day of the Dead celebrations, while superficially Christianized, preserve essential elements of Aztec understanding about death, transformation, and ongoing relationships between living and dead. The historical judgment of Aztec sacrifice reveals more about the cultural limitations of observers than about the practices themselves. European Christianity's emphasis on spiritual rather than physical offerings created intellectual frameworks that made sophisticated blood theology incomprehensible to conquistadors and missionaries, who could only perceive demonic evil in practices that served profound spiritual purpose. The contemporary relevance of Aztec sacrificial understanding lies not in its specific practices, but in its recognition that existence requires conscious participation in cosmic maintenance. In an era when human activity threatens planetary stability, Aztec theology's emphasis on reciprocal obligation and spiritual responsibility offers insights that purely materialistic worldviews cannot provide. The sacred flame that consumed countless hearts in Tenochtitlan's temples burned not with cruelty but with love, divine love so profound that gods died to create the world, and human love so grateful that mortals willingly died to sustain. In understanding this flame's true nature, we glimpse something essential about the relationship between consciousness and cosmos that transcends cultural boundaries and speaks to universal human experience of sacred obligation and spiritual purpose.